Good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Park, and I am the Vice President of Programming at Ulite Arts here in Miami, welcoming you all to tonight's virtual talks, taking place on Facebook Live. For those that are new to Talks is an ongoing lecture series in partnership with Locust Projects, where we feature some of today's top contemporary art curators as they share with us their curatorial practice and what inspires them. We are so excited to kick off our fall season with the illustrious Dan Cameron. But before I go into his bio, a couple housekeeping notes. Make sure to say hello in our Facebook chat. We love an active chat room. Clearly, we should be doing this talk in person, but seeing as we are stuck behind a computer screen for the unforeseeable future, we still want that level of interaction, so don't be shy and say hello. Tell us where you're logging in from. Most importantly, tell us what you're drinking tonight. It is happy hour somewhere. Also, we will be doing a short Q&A after Dan's presentation, which will be moderated by the fabulous Lori Mertes, Executive Director of Locust Projects. So if you have any questions for Dan, please put those questions in the chat and we will make sure to get those passed to Lori. Okay, so a little bit about Dan Cameron. Dan is a New York-based curator, art writer, arts administrator, archivist, and educator whose international career was launched with the 1986 exhibition Art and Its Double at Fundació la Caixa in Barcelona. Today, Cameron is perhaps best known for founding and administrating Prospect New Orleans, the triennial art exhibition that began operations barely a year after Hurricane Katrina. And of course, his amazing tenure as a senior curator at the New Museum from 1995 to 2006. Dan was recently artistic director of Open Spaces, a citywide visual and performing arts festival that took place in Kansas City, Missouri from August to October 2018, and a year prior served as a guest curator of the exhibition Kinesthesia at Palm Springs Art Museum, which was part of the Getty Foundation's Pacific Standard Time Initiative. Cameron was also chief curator at Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach, California from 2012 to 2015, and curator of the 2016 Cuenca Biennial in Ecuador. He most recently organized a retrospective survey of sculptor Leandro Ehrlich that is currently on view through October 2019 at Malba in Buenos Aires. We are so thrilled to have Dan join us tonight and to share his many years of cultivated wisdom in the field of contemporary art. So without further ado, please welcome Dan Cameron to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Esther, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Locust Projects and Ulite Arts for inviting me and being able to share this idea with you. It sounds like I haven't chosen a particularly upbeat topic for my presentation, but in a way, I think I have. Disasters in curatorial practice is, for me, kind of the result of a bout of thinking over the last several months about where we are as a society and the sort of wave, slow breaking wave of calamities that have happened to us. And you know, as a curator, it makes me think about what I do, how vocationally I may be positioned or not to work with artists to address those conditions. So I'm talking while sharing a text with you, just because I wanted to sort of lay out the parameters more or less in personal terms as you're reading the more theoretical description. So my talk is going to cover almost my entire career. I want to start in 1982, just a couple years after I arrived in New York. I had been volunteering at the New Museum, and Marcia Tucker invited me to make a couple of proposals, and I couldn't believe my luck. I was literally typing out envelopes for the fall fundraising campaign. So that morphed into Extended Sensibilities, which was the first exhibition of gay and lesbian identity, sensibilities, we called it then, in art. So I want to talk a little bit about that. In the early 80s, of course, it was still a very problematic thing to talk about your sexual identity. It wasn't understood as something that was needed. So right away, I was able to work with a fairly narrow group of artists who didn't mind that identification. I did a research trip to the West Coast, where I came across Charlie Brown, a commercial artist and painter in San Francisco, who frequently painted a friend of his who was a cross-dresser named Bai. And he did all of these kind of posed assemblage paintings of Bai, which were one of the things we included in the exhibition, because for us, transvestism or transgender identities are sometimes at the heart of the discussion culturally about gay and lesbian identity. I asked different artists who I knew of or who were already very much declared in a public way to be gay and to be making art about that identity. Harmony Hammond, who is recently returned to public view, was one of the most prominent artists who I invited to participate at that time. We had a very important outreach program at that time. We did a lot of public programs, including group panel discussions like the one you see here with Kate Millett, Jim Farrat, Vita Russo, Jeff Weinstein, Bertha Harris, an incredible group, and Edmund White, a really great group of people speaking to a packed house at the New School for Social Research. But the reason I wanted to start with this exhibition is because of this artwork, and I apologize for the quality of the photo. This is a work by John Henninger. It took him about 4 years to make. It's called Lying Man. It's a life-size, really a stuffed doll, and it's of a man posed in a gay bathhouse, ready for someone to come along and partner with him. And from the opening of the exhibition in October of 1982, when this was seen as sort of titillating and risque, to the end of the exhibition, where this piece was seen as really a bad example, really a bad judgment call, that we should not be in the gay community promoting promiscuous sex. So as AIDS developed, I began to think about my position as a curator and how I might be a little more conscious, a little more aware of what was coming down the road. So after I did the Art in its Double exhibition, I was invited back to Madrid to organize an exhibition called El Jardín Salvaje, the Savage Garden. And this was an exhibition of installation-based artists from the States. I just want to point out that it was the first time where I'd been working abroad, where every day after working with the artists on the installation, we would come back to one another's hotel room and watch the invasion, the Gulf War invasion taking place on TV. So Jessica Diamond, who had this idea in mind already, really insisted on playing it up, because the room that this mural is filling, which has dollar signs converted into barbed wire, was also the reception room for the exhibition. So I remember a very awkward reception where the American ambassador and his wife greeted the guests with this as the backdrop, and there was no place else to have them. There was something about the war environment at that point that sort of tinged a lot of works in Savage Garden with an air of implied violence. So even an artist like, Anne Hamilton makes a work in which being a carnivore is front and center in the thinking about what the meaning of the work is. Charles Ray, who wasn't in his realist phase at that point, presented a merry-go-round, which only had a lower portion that operated properly, and the horses and the carriage instead turned slowly backwards, creating a feeling of seasickness, almost nausea, right away in the viewers. And this again was a portrait that seemed a snapshot of a world out of bounds. The work that I really associate the most, though, with Savage Garden is this one, which of course is very well known in art historical terms, but this was the first occasion in which Felix Gonzalez Torres made this work, and it was specifically connected to his own personal life, his biography, and the chapter that he had spent as a boy or a young teenager in Madrid after being kind of sort of taken out of Cuba and brought into exile as a refugee. So the idea of it being a revenge, of course, is, as I think people know, it's about the weight of the piece corresponding to the weight of his and his lover's bodies, but also to the sacrament of communion, because the Catholicism, I think, was important to emphasize, being in the sort of home country. So working with Felix, working with Meyer Weissman, I think I became much more sensitive to how Latin America figures in Spain, where I had a different grounding and one that began earlier, and how this sort of post-colonial reality would figure into art being made by Latin American artists and then presented on a contemporary basis in Madrid. I'm only going to talk about two pieces, though. The first one is by Cacho, Alexis Leiva, a Cuban artist. And this was his first sort of international work. I know it's a blurry photo, but that's intentional, because when you walk in the room, this is what you see. You see nothing on the walls, and then you see reflection in the floor. And these are rafts. These are boats that have been confiscated by the Cuban Coast Guard, and they were meant to represent the deaths of people fleeing Cuba and never quite arriving. The other artist who I want to emphasize in this was Dora Salcedo. Again, fairly early in her career, Salcedo was working on her La Casa Viuda series, in which the house becomes a sort of widower or widow, grieving for the person who's gone, who's missing. So at that time, Salcedo's work was treating violence in Colombia, in her home country, but the violence was always depicted as something quiet and almost disappearing. Literally, in this case, bones disappearing into the fabric and the wood of the furniture, so that the violent reality is always sort of smoothed over in the best way possible by the house, which is, of course, in a state of mourning. So I joined the New Museum in '95 as senior curator. My first big exhibition was a retrospective of Carolee Schneemann, which was kind of a lifetime dream for me. So I just felt like this was going to be an incredible opportunity. And I just included here a list of some of the survey exhibitions I either organized, co-organized, or hosted in my position as the person in charge of programming at the museum. So I want to, again, just kind of single out a few things. Going back to the theme of AIDS, I think the most important engagement I had through these years was with the work of David Wojnarowicz and other members of his generation, including Martin Wong. But David's art and its growing importance many years after his death was something that really seemed to weigh on me, in particular, as someone who was roughly of his generation, who knew him, who crisscrossed with him a lot, and who had seen all of his exhibitions at the time that they were made in the early 80s. So being able to frame David Wojnarowicz for a New York audience for the first time since his death was a challenge because so much of the conversation about AIDS had in fact shifted from the late 80s to the late 90s because of the invention of the AIDS cocktail. And yet the lingering rage in Wojnarowicz's work, the refusal to accept the sort of status quo when it came to how societal homophobia determined the availability of treatments for people with AIDS. This was something that was still very palpably felt by the community, even this much later than the original appearance of AIDS 15 years before. The other big emergency that I think is worth mentioning, and anyone who's in New York or anywhere else, I guess, at that time would think about it as being the defining act of the last decade, which was the attacks on 9/11. So as senior curator, we had to get the museum open. And of course, for us, the exhibition that was on at that time was this retrospective that I curated of William Kentridge's work, of in particular his films. And of course, in this exhibition, the sort of revolt of the oppressed individual against the society that's holding him down is a theme through the exhibition, and violent reprisals figured into that as well. So what I noticed right away was that we had an obligation as a museum to our community to keep going in a way. And one of the first ways we were able to respond was by reaching out to the Lower Manhattan culture who had artist studios in residence on one of the upper floors of the World Trade Center at the time, famously one of the artists in residence, Paris. But of the surviving artists, sorry, this is a little bit loud. Of the surviving artists, really there was a desire to continue with the open studios tradition. And so we presented work a little more than a month after the 9/11 attacks in the new museum of the artists who had essentially lost their work in the attacks. And so the ability to connect with the work was really determined by the freshness, the rawness, if you want, of the wounds of the 9/11 attacks. This is Naomi Ben-Shahar. And what she was interested in doing was making parties in upper floors at night of people who had lamps, little lamps on their heads, and folks would be dancing in front of the windows. This was a week before 9/11. And so the work itself meant one thing at the time that it was made and something else quite different immediately afterwards. And of course, you know, now it's time, I think, maybe to look back at some of this work that was thought of in light of the trauma of the time and see if there's another sort of meaning or reality that we can derive from them. Another of the important programming decisions that we had to make in the wake of 9/11 was, would the program remain the same? We were hosting immediately after the Kentridge show a mid-career survey of the sculptor Tom Friedman. And this was one of the works that would be featured in the exhibition. So sort of a heart-wrenching discussion had to take place about, well, what are people's sort of post-traumatic conditions? How can people cope with this? Is it our obligation to sort of carry on, or should we take a step back and think about our position a little bit differently? Another exhibition that kind of came under strong discussion was Wim Delvoye's Cloaca, the room-size machine that duplicates the entire digestive function of the human body from consuming to defecation. And this was the work in which I think the most fear was being raised on the part of my colleagues as to whether this was really an appropriate path for a museum to take. So understanding what a museum's role is and being willing to redefine that role in the wake of a tragedy or catastrophe, I think was an important lesson from them. Also in the wake of 9/11, I was invited to curate the Istanbul Biennial. And as someone who is very concerned about the growth of Islamophobia in the United States, I embraced this mission, and I decided to address head on what was unfolding in real time, which was the buildup to the invasion of Iraq, which is a neighboring country of Turkey, which happened while we were in the final stages of preparing the exhibition. So in this case, one catastrophe led quite quickly, or in a couple of years, to another one. And again, looking back at some of the work produced for the biennial, I'm stunned by how evident a sense of violence jumps out. Monica Bonvicini's Stairway to Hell was actually made from chains that are suspending this stairwell in space. And it's going from a lit area above on the second floor down to a dark area below. And as you step in above, you're greeted by this smashed bulletproof glass. So the message of violence could not be clearer. It was there in many ways. The Thai Bo match, which was really a demonstration of Thai martial arts by Surasi Kusawong, became itself a picture of a conflict acted out in the most direct physical terms, with one body against another. Song Dong, at that time known for his mirror performances, where he smashed the mirror and you saw a reality behind it, really smashed that mirror with a lot of gusto when he was opening up the sort of view from the European side across the Bosphorus River to the Asian side of Istanbul and vice versa. War was part of a didactic approach. Kutle Gataman had a sort of special lifting of censorship at the time of the biennial. I'm not sure how much that's still in practice, but he was allowed to show this work, 1 on 1 = 1, which is really about the Cyprus conflict between Turkey and Greece, And you see the same woman in two guises, one discussing things clinically from the kind of abstract position of an academic expert, and then as a person, as someone who remembers the conflict as a girl and is still responding it to emotionally many years later. Tsuyoshi Ozawa created an ironic portrait of war by asking people who worked for the venues wherever he traveled to create a portrait of themselves brandishing groceries, dinner groceries, as if it were a weapon, and sort of tying these portraits together as a sort of a group portrait of the world on the edge of armed conflict. Nalini Malani had a spectacular projection inside the Yerbatan cisterns underneath the city. And the sort of phantasmagoric image of train scenery moving back and forth really just underscored the fact that the work is really treating the massacre of people fleeing Eastern India at the time of the partition. And her family happened to be among those people who had to flee to the West, to Mumbai. Araya Rastjärmensuk took on a very beautiful task in the middle of the Hagia Sophia of showing videos of herself reading poetry to unclaimed cadavers at the Bangkok morgue. This was, I've been thinking about this lately because the Hagia Sophia will no longer be a museum. It's now going to go back to being a place of worship. And we actually had to present this work to imams. They had already gone in that early year in 2003 from an administrative position to a religious position, even though it remained a museum for many years afterwards. Even Jennifer Steinkamp's projection of trees shivering had this kind of creepy, disturbing, nightmarish quality, like Medusa's, the snakes coming out of Medusa's head. But the signature piece of this project for me will always be Doris Salcedo's meditation on war. She was trying to consider how a nation understands that it's gone from a time of relative peace to a time of war, and when that moment slips. So for her, presenting an image of chaos, of apparent chaos, was a starting point, because that's what we think we see. That's what becomes clear from the outside, that there's a kind of a collapse into violence, into pandemonium. And yet this work, which consists of about 1,800 wooden chairs brought in from all over Turkey, only appears to be chaotic. In fact, when you see the work from ground level, you begin to understand the almost cabinet-making precision with which all of these chairs have been assembled with a very powerful infrastructure in the back so that they're flush to the face of the building. So suddenly you are more than aware of the mechanistic infrastructure that goes into making war with one's neighbors or with one's own citizens, as has happened multiple times in the modern history of Turkey. So after Hurricane Katrina, I, as a big fan of New Orleans culture, began to think about how I might get involved. At that point, I was sort of crossing the line from being a curator interested in the artistic impact, the aesthetic impact, and becoming one that was more engaged in perhaps the humanitarian dimension of it. I really wanted to be involved in a particular way. And in New Orleans, which is a tourist city where tourist dollars make a big difference, I understood that a lot of the qualms that curators had about the touristic dimension of contemporary art biennials could really be set aside for the purpose of the city itself and its benefit. So I want to run through a number of pieces that to me seem to reflect a little bit of the tone of what we're living through today. Leander Ehrlich's work, Too Late, No Escape, shows the window of a house with a ladder climbing up to it, but the house has been swept away. So there's a part of this story that we cannot know, and it's all happening within close sight of the levees whose collapse resulted in the flooding of the lower Ninth Ward district, which is where this piece was installed. Also in the Lower Ninth Ward was Mark Bradford's now legendary work, Mithra. It's the form of an ark, like Noah's Ark, that would be able to sort of slide through the flooded streets and pick people up along the way and save them, because that seemed to be one of the things that New Orleans most conspicuously lacked, was a great big boat to save people. New York artist Paul Valinsky had a much more practical response. He's like, well, okay, we have problems with power, we have problems with the grid. Why don't I come up with a completely passive powered vehicle that allows artists to respond to emergency scenes, but at the same time generates power in a way, you can't see, but there's little wind turbines on top that also generate wind power. He drove this vehicle throughout New Orleans and found himself supplying power to neighborhoods that were having occasional blackouts and brownouts, because even 2 years later, the grid wasn't completely restored. Sanford Biggers showed this work, which had been presented the year before in Kansas City, Blossom, that took on very different meanings and poignancy there in New Orleans on the site of the U.S. Mint, where the kind of crushing of the piano by the tree and the sound of the artist singing Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit along with the piano accompaniment had very, very powerful historic and emotional resonance in this historic site. Wageshi Mutu created an intervention on the Lower Ninth Ward that also had a sort of a helping hand dimension to it. She was interested in the house of Sarah Lasty, whose husband had been drummer for Fats Domino. She lost her house, then she lost a lot of money to unscrupulous contractors and was sort of in a bind. And what again she did was stepped in and created this structure that you see for the foundation that had been poured. It's sort of a skeleton house with Christmas tree lights. And then 2 years later, using donations from prints that were sold, was able to actually create a replacement house for Miss Sarah. So we all went down for Mother's Day in 2010 for the opening, and you'll notice there's a worn out Prospect One sign leaning against the house. I think she was one of the very few people in New Orleans that had saved one, specifically so that she could say, well, the Prospect One is still going on and my house is proof of that. Skylar Fine, a New Orleans-based artist, had a different way of using, if that's the right word, Prospect to memorialize a local tragedy that had been very, very traumatic to the gay community in New Orleans, and that was the fire by arson that destroyed the upstairs lounge in New Orleans in 1973. More than 29 people died, and because they were gay, the way in which their deaths were treated was really scandalous and just made it more painful for the people involved. So what Skylar Fine tried to do was recreate not the space itself, but the sort of ambiance of being a gay bar in the Deep South in the early 70s and what that meant and what sex symbols were and the sort of branding that went on before there was any such thing as a gay demographic for consumption. He was interested in the identities of these men who died and trying to encapsulate some of it for us several decades later. Navin Rawanchaikul from Bangkok actually wanted to find a way to connect with the local post-Katrina recovery. And he quickly learned that someone with a name very similar to his, Narvin Kimball, the banjo player for the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, had died not that long after Katrina, but he had been evacuated to Georgia, to Augusta, and died there and didn't have a jazz funeral back in New Orleans, which was very... if you're a jazz musician in New Orleans, there's a very strictly observed tradition of music that goes on until your remains are laid in the ground. So 2 years after the fact, Navin proposed to Narvin's family that he present Narvin Kimball's jazz funeral as part of Prospect One. So this was an amazing opportunity for us to open the exhibition, which was an international exhibition, by saying to the jazz-centered community in New Orleans, this is also about you. You know, contemporary art is able to take this gap, this hurt, and somehow make an artwork around it, and we can all join together. And in this case, not just saying goodbye to Narvin Kimball, but also paying honor to his life. And you can see the signs are being carried down the street, which is a tradition fairly widely followed even to this day in Thailand, where the artist is from. We also wanted to continue with Prospect, the investigation into sort of indigenous arts like the Mardi Gras Indians. I was particularly taken with Victor Harris, who's the big chief of Fayayay, and presented a sort of mini retrospective of his suits at the museum. And I also took on a sort of an activist role at the CAC, where I was for 3 years director of visual arts. So prior to Prospect, we had an exhibition called Something from Nothing, and invited Mario Rizzi to come in and look at the sort of permanent underclass, the people who had come into New Orleans to help dig it out, and what were they doing today, and what were their lives like. And we ended up having a taqueria for free for the opening project. Exhibitions that I maybe wouldn't have normally tackled, including photography exhibitions, kept presenting themselves as something to try out. Ben Loki, who is a Mississippi-based commercial photographer, he did fashion, he also did dance companies, had 90% of his photos were destroyed. But he began scanning the remains and came up with hundreds of images that we then worked with him to sift through to make a work that's about what was lost, but also what remains from what used to be. Kevin Klein, a local photographer who lives in the upper Ninth Ward, does a lot of photographs of people in his neighborhood. And we presented a sort of mini survey of his work at the CAC. We also presented a body of work by Sonia Rieger for Birmingham, Alabama, who had been documenting the phenomenon of drag balls that were happening in rural places, not outside of cities, but in fairly remote locations, and just who the participants were and what that life was like. So I felt that being part of New Orleans, I was part of what was happening in the community. And then I came to understand that each catastrophe seems to have another one in its wake. In 2010, there was a major earthquake in Haiti. And very quickly, in fact, in 8 days, we had to change the program and put on an exhibition of Tina Girard's collection of Haitian prayer rugs, so that as many as possible, prayer flags, sorry, could be sold to benefit Haitian relief at that time. And it was actually fairly successful and allowed people in New Orleans to see a collection that really had only occasionally been shown under very sort of restricted circumstances prior to that. So Prospect 2 opened in 2011, maybe a different level of a feeling of emergency at that time, but you still had projects like Joyce Scott's portrait in jewels and beads of a woman literally lynched from a tree out in front of the Newcomb College Art Gallery on the campus of Tulane University. And you also had Pavel Wojtaszek, his amazing 360-degree video projection showing places in New Orleans that were effectively under sea level, and how the horizon would sort of cut through as a consistent visual feature, and letting us know that we're just always on the verge of being completely submerged in this part of the world. Alexis Rockman created a giant mural showing a battle between indigenous species of animals and imported species of animals, and how over time they will begin to contest the same territory as their food sources run out. And this, in fact, was so well received that it was purchased for acquisition by the New Orleans Museum of Art. So I left New Orleans to go to California, did a number of shows at the Orange County Museum. And the show that I most want to talk about, though, is the California Pacific Triennial, which was the first time that a sort of regional show had expanded to become one that looked at artists coming from all the different countries of the Pacific Rim. But I want to talk about this project. Hugo Crossweight from Tijuana, Mexico, did a piece called Carpas. And Carpas in Mexico is just sort of a traveling small town mobile circus, where they sort of roll into town, put up their tarps, their carpas, like a tent, and then put on a show for people there. So there are always stock characters who are highly identified. And one of the things that really stood out to me at that point was a character in the corpus, La Narizona. And La Narizona was a great pun because it's sort of meant to identify Pinocchio as the person who lies and lies and their nose grows. But it's also a sort of a portrait of the governor at that time of the state of Arizona, Jan Brewer, who right at the time that we presented this exhibition had been drawing a lot of press to her claim that headless corpses were showing up on the Arizona side of the Mexican national border. A completely fabricated story. And this was the first time I think I was aware of the use of misinformation and the idea that a US politician would knowingly fabricate stories in the belief that people who are capable of being inflamed by hot button issues like immigration will find themselves not dealing with immigration per se, but dealing with scapegoats, people that are meant to suffer instead of having an ongoing conversation. I also was very struck by the contribution of Adan Vallecillo. He's based in Honduras. He makes a lot of his work as a sort of reflection of the economic reality of Honduras, which had its own natural rubber industry, nothing like Brazil's, but enough that there were aspirations once upon a time to play a role in the budding automobile tire trade. And so today, Honduras is a country where every car tire is precious. They get patched and repatched, especially the inner tubes. And what Vallecillo tried to do, I think, was to create a sort of minimalist field in which, as you get closer and closer, you experience the transformation of an economic, industrial reality into something that seems like a wound, something that's been experienced by a person as closely and as intimately as their skin. So I took on this role in 2018 of doing an exhibition in Kansas City. I love Kansas City. I think it's a very fascinating culture, especially being in the middle of the country, and especially being part of what I began to think of as a sort of Trump country. I am always someone who follows politics. I like follow politics in the way that other people maybe like sports. And I was really interested in the argument that people who live in metropolitan centers in this country don't really understand why other Americans could have voted for Trump and maybe in many cases continue to support his presidency. So this gave me an opportunity to sort of be working in a place where, to my mind, we were sort of helping to hold up sort of traditions of cosmopolitanism and Western civilization, and if you want, secular culture, but in a very high level. So you've been reading through the description, you know that there's a big performing arts component to it. But what I just want to show you here are a few of the projects that we made, which I think are relevant to the discussion. First of all, this is Federico Solmi. He works with gaming technology to create multi-screen projections. This is a work called The Great Farce, in which the saga of America is told with Columbus at one end and Trump at the other, and sort of a consistent triumphalism shown through the persona of the conquistador, who comes in, asks no questions, grabs everything, and then considers whatever is taken as the appropriate fruits of their struggle. So this is this moment of triumph. Solmi's work hovers on this sort of borderline between the absurd and the phantasmagoric. There's something silly but also scary about his work, and I think that's really a quality that he's able to encapsulate from the time that we're living in. Nick Cave did a fantastic work. Nick is a Missouri native. He actually got his undergraduate degree at Kansas City Art Institute, so he has a strong following and a big love for Kansas City. So he created this work as a way of making surrounding installation using multiple video projections that completely enveloped a giant former Catholic church. So as you're standing in the middle of this church where the floor has been converted into waves, you suddenly see all of these masks surrounding you and collapsing into the space, and then a very almost nightmarish marionette theater. So I'll give it about 10 seconds. Hear that Sykes-Isle Industries is the artistic identity of a Kansas City artist named Phil Schaefer, who does a lot of murals. That's his specialty. And he began thinking, after I invited him to be part of Open Spaces, about how you can use the look and the language of advertising to sort of sneak another kind of message in, a message that's really about consciousness. In this case, I think playing off the idea of being woke in the present time. And so Wake Up and Live, we only see the artist rendering here. The photograph isn't nearly as good. You can see that he covered a 75-foot length of wall in front of a large artist compound called the drugstore, which is still in great shape to this day. And I think a lot of people drive by it asking themselves, what does that mean to actually wake up and live? So the piece that I want to sort of single out here from Open Spaces is Ebony Patterson, who, when she came to Kansas City, she wanted to find a body of water to work with. And we kept finding bodies of water and they weren't quite right. And then we were walking in Swope Park, trying to find a trailhead. And she said, oh, what's that over there? And what that was this, the Harry Gilkey Memorial Pool, which was a ruined remnant of a pool. This is the plaque memorializing Harry Gilkey, who was, by all accounts, a splendid human being, making summer camp facilities available for kids with disabilities. But when she was mulling this over, Ebony Patterson said, I'm thinking about the kids. They don't really have a memorial. And kids are such a vulnerable and exposed part of our society today. Ebony comes from Jamaica, and there's there's a problem with youth and violence, as there is in this country. And so she wanted to memorialize sort of youth, the loss of youth. And she did so by completely transforming the pool using thousands and thousands of artificial flowers. And so this project, which took a couple of months to complete, became sort of a focal point. It was in a remote part of the corner, but people would find ways to get there, coming up with groups of bicyclists or hikers, and people who use the park regularly wound up bringing other people. So it became a way of sharing a not very well used park in Kansas City, and one that I should also say is located on the black side of the color line. So there's a kind of a psychological resistance, if you will, on the part of many Kansas Cityans to going and exploring freely that part of the city. So in many ways, what Ebony Patterson was doing with her work, and I think many of the artists in Swope Park tried to do, was to bridge that difference. So I'm kind of finished with my own work here. This is a detail of the work, but I didn't want to wrap up just yet. I just wanted to leave all of you with my experience from this summer. And because, as you know, with the coronavirus pandemic and with the Black Lives Matter resurgence after the killing of George Floyd, and of course the economic crash that's affecting so many lives, I realized that many people are actually sitting at home wondering how their jobs, their work, is going to be restructured in these current times. And so as you can see from the short piece that I wrote, the first weekend of Black Lives Matter's protests were sort of punctuated at the end by a raid on boutiques in high-end stores in Soho. And that resulted in lots and lots and lots of plywood to cover smashed windows. So when I realized that this was something that I needed to see, I needed to understand how young artists in the United States were dealing with this situation, I found that I was coming upon fresh paintings that were made. Well, in this case, I was lucky enough to learn that the artist is the daughter of a longtime friend of mine. But for many of the artists, the identity is not as important as the urgency of the message, because when we're at a time in our country where we're contemplating how we better value and understand the value of Black lives, I think that artists already in a way know. And one of the reasons I understood that artists are giving us a path, they're giving us a way, not out, but a way forward, is understanding how in these street art manifestations, there's an undercurrent of appropriation, a very clearly derived, appropriated bits, if you want, from fine arts culture. For example, in the double Colin Kaepernick here, it seems obvious to me that he is actually, whoever made this, the artist that made it, is quoting Andy Warhol's double Elvis. This doubling of a recognizable figure is something we understand in our culture, and it's partly because doubling identical images is a technique that Andy Warhol introduced to us. Elijah McClain, I think, is a name that's become much more familiar to people who only had a sort of partial familiarity with the deaths of young men and young people of color at the hands of police. I'm including him here not just because I find the painting poignant, but also because if you've ever read the description of the circumstances of Elijah McClain's death, you'll understand that he was an artist and he was killed in part because there was a sort of an acting out, if you want, of his impulses that was misunderstood fatally in that case. But back to appropriation, I had to look at this particular painting a couple of times before I realized that it's carefully based on Georgia O'Keeffe's Over the Clouds painting in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. And the notion that an artist feeling a sense of powerlessness, of needing to make this statement and using one of the sort of watershed historical works of American art of the 20th century as a springboard for that message, I think was absolutely brilliant. But there's nothing really that prepared me for coming across this painting, where Henri Matisse, one of the great masters of the early 20th century, finds a new role where one of his most understood single figure compositions is no longer a delicate, graceful figure against a blue tropical ground. He's another innocent human being who's been shot through the heart. So I don't have anything to do with the making of this work, and I'm not saying that I do. And this isn't really about wanting to put in an exhibition. Sharing it with you today is about me coming to terms with the idea that I'm a curator, and that sharing art that is urgent at a time when I think it can best benefit the people who I can share it with, is really at the absolute core of my vocation as a curator. So I want to thank you very much, and really invite Lori to come back onto the screen.
Dan, thank you so very much. And I really love that you're using your platform to share these works. Incredibly powerful to see. So thank you for that. I don't know if we're going to switch over in a second so you can see our two talking heads. But as we do that, I'm going to take a moment, Dan, to do my Miami sort of memorial moment of having you as my very first public program speaker, you and Kenny Sharp in 1994 and 95, when it was the Center for the Fine Arts that became MAM, that became PAM. So here we are so many years later and lives later. I love that I get to talk with you here on our Talks program.
I love being back in Miami, even though I'm really just sitting in New York, but I feel I'm with you.
I wish we'll have to find a way to actually physically get you here at some point. But I do also want to thank you for doing studio visits with 6 different Miami-based artists online yesterday and today. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
And that's a really important and an essential part of what Talks is able to do, not just bringing you and your curatorial practice to light with, a broad public, but also having your eyes and ears and experience and advice for our Miami artist community. And, that's really fantastic, and appreciate that time. So I know I'm getting a couple of questions. I'm going to ask one first because as a young curator, and I have to admit, everyone here, who's followed me a little, I have a lot of curatorial crushes, and they are a lot of our talk speakers. So I love this program so passionately. But I take great inspiration from curators who work outside of traditional spaces, who take art and artists outside of the museum walls. And I'm curious when that really started, or if, I know you were curating even when you were in Bennington College. When was that moment that you knew or gave yourself permission to venture out of that space? And were there any role models or inspiration that kind of gave you that permission, so to speak, in your practice?
Sure. I think that there's almost always a French antecedent. And in this case, there was an exhibition done in the end of the 80s called Les Chambres des Amis. And it was done I'm sorry, I cannot tell you where it was done. I'm going to say Strasbourg, but I think that's not right. But the premise of the exhibition was that each artist had a project in the private home of a different person in this community. And the visitors would go from home to home. And I remember after learning about that, I thought, well, the multi-venue project is such a great one. And I had been able to go to Johannesburg in '97 to see Okwe and Weezor's incredible biennial there, which occupied about 10 different venues. But it was really, it was the show EVA, Exhibition of Visual Art in Limerick, Ireland, where I had the first opportunity prior to Istanbul to sort of look at a town and see the city itself as a sort of a starting point. And then within that framework, just select venues that seemed to match with what artists were doing. And it just seemed to fit so well with the way I was thinking. And the artists responded very positively. And then the public responded very positively. And so from that point on, I guess it's become almost a fallback position. If I have an opportunity to spread an exhibition out, which happened in New Orleans and also happened in Cuenca, Ecuador a few years ago, I go for it because there's a way of grounding contemporary art in the already existing daily experience of the people who live there that, it allows you to play a little bit with their own daily experience and reinforce the idea that you don't have to cross the threshold of an art museum to have a fantastic art experience. So that's been sort of the goal point, is pushing things outside of the protection of the museum as an institution and seeing how the public responds when art just sort of pops up in there on their way to work.
And that's just been so important, as we've all, not been able, our museums haven't been able to open. The work that's out there in the public sphere has been, something that's been really essential in many ways for artists to continue to work, for venues to continue to have visibility. I know the New York Public Art Fund has done, a lot on the outside realm, but, in the public sphere, but they've even pushed their practice in a new way. Part two of that, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I'm also discovering sort of street art projects that have been kind of tucked into the nooks and crannies of my neighborhood on the Lower East Side. And I found that really fulfilling. And then Abrams Art Center, which is right around the corner from me on Grand Street, had done just before the pandemic a series of street art blow-ups of photographs that came from sort of a family-run photo store on Delancey Street. And they put them all over the city, not all over the city, but all over the neighborhood. And it just became one of those things where I thought, if I was a busy New Yorker going about my art world professional life, I would have never seen these, but now I walk around.
Your eyes are peeled, right?
I'm looking for stuff, but I'm also more available to what's just there on the sidewalk because I'm spending more time walking on the sidewalk just to walk. So these little revelations add up, I think, over time.
I think that's a good segue on this topic to go to Sonia Baez Hernandez. I've got a few questions from our participants. How could we formulate the newness of a pandemic that interrogates the conventions of exhibitions? When thinking about climate change, what you envision the role of museums, galleries, and possibly the disappearing of that infrastructure?
I don't see disappearance as quite this looming reality so much as I see a need for a radical adaptation. I depend a lot on art galleries, and art galleries pre-pandemic were becoming a bit of an endangered species. I got to be honest with you. The art fair phenomena had sort of sucked a lot of the energy out of the gallery scene. And so people like me who really like to be in a quiet room with a bunch of artworks and just some time to soak it all in, I felt like, I was becoming more of a minority in the art world, and that the way to consume art nowadays was to crowd ourselves into these spaces and to walk by booths and carry on conversations with a lot of people while checking, our Instagram page. So I wonder if, to a degree, there's also going to be a going back to valuing a more contemplative relationship to art, where we're on more intimate, unmediated terms with the work, and we can see it for ourselves or in a more private setting, because that is what's happening in galleries near where I am. And I understand from a business standpoint, this isn't going to last forever, but right now, I think galleries are providing a tremendous service to the rest of us, because museums are starting to open up too, but these smaller galleries were filling in the gaps in a very crucial way. I think that public art is going to become more prominent insofar as, an artwork that's in a park near you is something that you can approach on your own terms, at your own time, under the circumstances that you like. And it's not the same as, we feel panic now if we're in a space where we can't get out or where there's not a cross breeze. It's just where our head is collectively right now. And so I think that we can't brush this world away that we got used to, but we have to sort of roll with the adaptation and to find out these new possibilities or these abandoned older possibilities that suddenly have a new relevance in the contemporary situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. I'm sure you have a ton of stories. Some of the backstories, the basic logistics of doing, again, sort of that more non-traditional work, whether it's Wengetchis, whether there's permitting deals, that whole collaborative process between the artist and or the site or city that you're working in. Mm-hmm. Can you share one or two of your most interesting moments as a curator trying to make, Doris Salcedo's wall of chairs happen in a city, sort of just as the United States is invading Iraq, for example, little things like that.
Well, but Doris's piece went off without a hitch, so there's not really much of a story
That's amazing
to tell, except there's just so many people who worked on it and so many individuals who were involved, right down to the neighborhood and the surrounding buildings. It was in a sort of a wholesale hardware district, so it became, the locals insisted that the piece stay up after the biennial was over.
Nice.
Because on some weird level, it was like advertising to them. There's also an artist who got booted from the Istanbul Biennial, Rogelio Lopez Cuenca. And to this day, I have not seen physical evidence, but he made street signs that indicated where points of conflict were in the world. And on one of the street signs, he reportedly included a place name, Kurdistan. And according to domestic politics in Turkey, there is no such thing as Kurdistan. There will never be such a thing as Kurdistan. And the word Kurdistan is absolutely forbidden. So he left country early, and I think he was happy to get home safely. But, as I mentioned before, there was a lift of censorship. So when you do that with an artist and say, well, you're permitted to do more things now, there's always going to be an artist who says, well, how about this thing that's one step closer to
how far can I go?
Yeah, how far can I push it? And he pushed it one step too far.
Gotcha. I do want to. What's that?
I love him for it because I believe that you as a curator, you've got to trust artists. You can't falter in your dedication and your commitment to getting the artist's vision achieved. You've just got to go as far as you have to.
That's quotable, folks. Let's put that out there.
I think any curator knows what I'm talking.
Well, and artists, really are going to appreciate hearing that, because that's not always the case. I happen to work in a place by choice because I had worked in museums, and Locust Projects we try to be a place of yes, where the most wild, ambitious ideas can be realized. And as a curator in museums, I couldn't always do that. So that's right. Really important to me as well. I do want to do one little quick shout out. Maria Elena Angulo made a note when your slide on Hugo Crosswaith came up that he just gave a talk at the Frost Museum here in Miami an hour ago.
No kidding me.
No kidding. Oh. So I just wanted to make that little shout out.
Oh, he's a great person and great artist.
So I have a question from George Fishman, sort of picking up on other crises that we're facing in our nation and across the globe. He's asking what's next for you, actually, and how optimistic are you that the surge of attention to racial injustice will result in long-term reform?
That's like asking me what my favorite color is, and then have I stopped beating my wife. What's next for me? I'm working on some projects I can't talk about, but I did just finish writing my first book.
Oh, wow. Can you reveal?
I can. It's a book on the paintings of Nicole Eisenman, and I'm very, very excited about it. It's coming out early in 2021 with Lund Humphreys, our London-based publisher. In the question about race, the word attention stands out, the attention being given to the situation. And I'm not really sure that like media attention or exposure is really what we're depending on in this situation. Now, there's always going to be a fluctuation. I think that at some point in early summer, something like 70% of Americans really identified with the aims of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that has shifted downward a little bit. I think that was always to be expected. And I do not know, and I think anybody would shy away from making any predictions, but I think that Americans are beginning to understand that the way we are taught the history of our country is deeply, deeply deceptive. And there are reasons. And if we want to pick them apart, we can do that. But there are reasons that certain truths have been withheld from us. And so I do think that more and more, white allies of people of color who are looking for justice, so how to address systemic racism in the United States, I think they're looking to us to, it's not about examining your own heart specifically or just saying like, I'm not a racist, but actually committing to anti-racist behavior. So it's not about calling out racism, but really understanding how it works structurally, because the mechanisms are hidden and they're hidden for a reason. So, rather than saying, well, I don't want to be racist, or I can't be racist, or I won't be racist, I think that it starts by being deeply honest with yourself and saying, how have I benefited or expressed or somehow manifested racist beliefs or ideology that I never consciously signed up for, but they were sort of fed to me. They were, I didn't really have much of a choice. I was unconscious. And I think all of us, when we are honest with ourselves, we understand that it's not enough to not harbor feelings of hostility, that you actually do need to be working on this as a project on an ongoing basis. And it's like so many other things in American society. Once you hit a tipping point, then you're really only gaining allies. We're very, very far from social justice and economic equality. And if we want that to be our goal, then we have to use all of our creativity to find ways of getting there that work for each of us.
That was fantastic. I think that's a really great place to end. I'm sitting here, I can't help but it's just this, I don't know if everyone's seeing the same screen I'm seeing with, the piece from the Black Lives Matter street painting in Soho of the Matisse figure. And, just that subtle shift, and it changes everything. That idea of new ways of seeing and thinking, how artists get us to see things differently. Really,
and cultural appropriation is
cultural appropriation, just the most subtle thing, and bam, it's something completely different. I want to thank you so much, Dan, for your talk and for your time, and
thank you, Laura,
for all the work that you have given to the curatorial field. It's you look like such a young guy, but you got a whole lot of history behind you. It's really tremendous, and I just thank you for that.
Well, I think Gypsy Rose Lee said it best, which is, you got to start young if you're going to stick it out.
There you go. There you go.
Sorry, she did say that though.
Well, I think that's pretty great advice as well. I'm going to just, thank everyone who's participated and remind everyone that our next talks is Erin Cristoval, who's the associate curator at the Hammer Museum. That's going to be on October 14th. And then we have Nicholas Bohm, who's the director of the New York Public Art Fund, who's going to be November 11th. So stay tuned for those. And as always, this talk and all of our talks are available at Talks Miami, talks.miami. And Dan, if you've missed any of your friends and peers and colleagues, I invite you to go check some of those out as well. And that's really it. I think we'll close out and say good night.
Good night, and thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.